Okay, so the time is 5:51. I'm not necessarily giving myself a time limit, but it's good to keep track of time. All right, so here we go. So the title of this presentation that I'm so far is The Socialist Workers' Party and Black Nationalism from Marx through the 1960s, a history through the literature. Most of this presentation will be text. It'll be excerpts from readings, and I plan to create a packet that viewers can, participants can read with and flip through at their own will during the presentation. Yeah, so not a lot of pictures, but a lot of text. So some people attending the lecture might already be interested in such things as Black radicalism. Other people might be already interested in the history of socialism in the United States of America. But for me and for the viewers, I think the key concept that's binding everything together, even though this is a presentation about the about Black politics, and it concerns the history of socialism in the United States of America, I think at the forefront is the concept, the very broad concept of nationalism. So for me, and again, nationalism is a very broad concept, but for me personally, when I think of nationalism, I think of several different images. And as you're listening to this and as we're going through the presentation, I want for you to think for yourself what sort of images are conjured up in your mind when you think of the term nationalism. So one thing one might think of is the great democratic revolutions of early modern history, such as the American Revolution on the top left. One might also think of such things as the Pact or the Treaty of Westphalia, which was a part of the history of the Dutch Revolt, another one of the early great democratic revolutions of Europe, and the Treaty of Westphalia being one event that many scholars point to as being the origin of, or the beginning of modern nationalism. Other people might think of the sort of nationalism and the imperialism that led to World War I, and which World War I was a product of and part of. And that's illustrated on the bottom left. One might also think of the nationalism of anti-colonial movements. So on the bottom right, the Gandhi movement was a part of Indian nationalism, the growth of Indian nationalism. And in that case, opposed to the imperialism and colonialism of the Indian subcontinent by the British Empire. So the concept of nationalism, and I was already interested in Black nationalism, and I realized that a big impetus for me doing this project is that the Socialist Workers' Party, a United States Communist Party, stands sort of alone in its application of the idea of nationalism to the Black population in the United States. For a long time, it was one of the few socialist parties that saw the Black population that saw the importance of the relationship between the Black population of the United States and the idea of nationalism and its political ramifications and implications. So first, I'll have to introduce very briefly the Socialist Workers' Party. So the Socialist Workers' Party, or the SWP, was a communist party that, and it actually still exists, but in a very different form. It was a Trotskyist party, and it was led by an activist named James P. Cannon. who was active in the early 20th century communist movement in the United States. The party follows the so-called left opposition in the Soviet Union, in the early Soviet Union, which was led by a revolutionary named Leon Trotsky, but the party claims to follow the ideas of Karl Marx, Frederick Engels, Lenin, and Trotsky. It was formed in 1938. However, the core leaders of what comes to be known as the SWP kind of formed out of the expulsion from the Communist Party of the United States, the CPUSA. Right, and we're going to be looking at a little bit of James Buchanan's writings as well in this presentation. And this is very brief. I'm actually going to condense this and skip over this a little bit, but just very briefly, I wanted to touch on the fact that there's a lot of confusion about what Black nationalism is and is not. A lot of times you'll hear the term Black nationalism used almost interchangeably with such terms like Black radicalism, but that's kind of a confusion, and especially for this presentation, I need to make a distinction. Black radicalism is a much more general concept, but Black nationalism, for me at least, is a particular idea of national consciousness within the Black population, well, within Black people. And for this presentation, it's specifically going to be looking at the idea that the Black population in the United States constitutes a nation, that Black people in the US are an oppressed nationality that may seek out independence. You know, and a brief history of Black nationalism would have to touch on such things as the Haitian Revolution, the creation of a Black state, a free Black republic in the Caribbean, a little bit about the period of Reconstruction, the Garvey movement of the early 20th century, Marcus Garvey and his organization being probably the largest Black nationalist organization in history, and one of the biggest Black, maybe even the biggest Black organization of a Black radical group ever. The Nation of Islam, which was formed earlier in the 20th century, but really grew, exploded really in the 60s. And of course, the independence movement on the African continent with leaders like Kwame Nkrumah being one of the most prominent. Okay, we'll steamroll ahead. And I just wanted to give you, so this would be included in the packet, but I just want to show you a small timeline of dates. So 1883, Marx's death, 1914, the founding of Garvey's organization, the Russian Revolution in 1917, 1928, the year in which James Buchanan, as well as a core of Trotskyist activists, were expelled from the CPUSA, and that expulsion would eventually form into the Socialist Workers' Party, the SWP. 1928 to 1934 is when the Communist Party actually themselves adopt their own formulation on Black nationalism. This actually grew out of discussions with the Communist International, which was under the control of the Soviet Union. 1933 is a very important interview with Leon Trotsky amongst activists, well, actually one activist related to James Buchanan. 1938 is the founding of the Socialist Workers' Party, the SWP. 1938, there are some three key interviews with Leon Trotsky, who was living in exile in Mexico City, on Black nationalism. Then 1939 was the adoption of two key resolutions on Black nationalism. There was another resolution that we'll look at in 1948 just to throw in some context for the history, African American history, 1954 was Brown v. Board. In 63, the SWP adopts a key resolution called the Freedom Now Resolution. 1963 was also the year of the March on Washington, and 65 was the year that Malcolm X was assassinated. Okay, so before we can dive into the SWP's, the resolutions that it created, its own writings, we have to go back to the writings that it purports to have, to be a follower of, to have followed. So we have to go to the writings of Karl Marx, which are of course very vast, and what he wrote on the issue of nationalism in his own time. It's, there's a lot to go to, but I want to just isolate one excerpt from one reading, and we can, in studying some of an excerpt, we can look at and try to isolate some key points that will be important in the rest of the quotes that we'll be looking at. So one thing that's important to realize is that Marx was living in a world of European imperialism. Much of the world was colonized by Western nations. And within Europe, there were quote unquote oppressed nations dominated politically and economically by other European nations. And from this situation, Marx developed his own ideas about nationalism, and particularly for us, nationalism of oppressed nations, oppressed nationalities. So the first quote that we'll be looking at is from an 1882 correspondence. And I'm just going to read through both of the quotes. They're from the same piece, but isolated. An international movement of the proletariat is possible only among independent nations. Thus, I hold the view that there are two nations in Europe which do not only have the right, but the duty to be nationalistic before they become internationalists: the Irish and the Poles. They are internationalists of the best kind if they are very nationalistic. The Poles have understood this in all crises and have proved it on the battlefields of all revolutions. Take away their expectation to reestablish Poland, or persuade them that the new Poland will soon fall into their laps by itself, and they are finished with their interests in the European Revolution. We, in particular, have no reason whatever to block their irrefutable striving for independence. So this is from 1882, and from this small excerpt from one piece, we can see a couple things. One thing is that Marx believed that even within Europe, there were nations which were oppressed, that were oppressed nationalities, one might say, nations which might be struggling for their own independence from other dominating nations. And explicitly, two of those are Ireland, which was colonized by the British Empire, and Poland, which was dominated by neighboring empires, specifically Prussia and the Russian Empire. Another thing we see is that Marx is explicitly saying that supporting nationalism of these oppressed nations is not antithetical to or inhibitory to the project of building an international movement. And for Marx, because he's a communist, building a socialist movement that is international. So these concepts will reappear in later readings, even though very early on we're seeing them in the 19th century, that Marx is saying that there are such things as oppressed nations, and even within Europe, and to support the struggle is not antithetical to any sort of socialist internationalism. Just making sure I'm recording. All right, so we also have to look at the writings of Vladimir Lenin, because the SWP historically saw themselves as being within the tradition of Bolshevik Leninism, coming out of the Russian Revolution. So for Lenin, Lenin was living in a large country, Russia, an empire with many different peoples. This large country with many different nationalities was ruled over by an autocratic emperor called the Tsar. What Lenin noticed was that Russia under the Tsar was highly oppressive, and particularly oppressive to these minority peoples. It said that Russia was the quote unquote prison house of nations, that there were all of these nationalities, from Tatars to Chechens to various Western Asian groups, to certain Jewish groups. And he called this the oppression that these nationalities or minority people faced Great Russian Chauvinism. That term reappears in a lot of his writing. And Lenin wrote a lot about how the quote unquote oppressed nationalities were in a sort of impressive relationship with Tsarism and the entirety of ethnic Russians in general. This moved him to be very aware, to be acutely aware of other peoples in similar oppressive relationships. And in 1914, he wrote a general tract, a book, small book, on what he called the right of oppressed nations to self-determination. It was called The Right of Nations to Self-Determination, 1914. And in this, he talks about basically the nationalism of the oppressed. So let me read this quote. He says, "To accuse those who support freedom of self-determination, i.e. freedom to secede, of encouraging separatism, is as foolish and hypocritical as accusing those who advocate freedom of divorce of encouraging the destruction of family ties. Just as in bourgeois society, the defenders of privilege and corruption, on which bourgeois marriage rests, oppose freedom of divorce, so too in the capitalist state, repudiation of the right to self-determination, i.e. the right of nations to secede, means nothing more than defense of the privileges of the dominant nation and police methods and administration to the detriment of democratic methods." So like Marx, we're seeing a couple key concepts. One is that Lenin is defining what he calls self-determination as essentially the freedom to secede, the freedom to seek independence, the freedom to part ways with an oppressor nation or oppressors. Another thing that we're seeing is that this freedom of self-determination, is to Lenin a democratic right, just like rights, the right of divorce is a democratic right. He's saying that the right to self-determination of oppressed nationalities is a democratic right. And is to be supported not just within some sort of socialism, but even within the current system of what he would call bourgeois capitalism. Yeah, okay, so that kind of establishes some of the thinking historically of Marxism and Bolshevik Leninism, and its thinking behind nationalism, and in particular nationalism of oppressed nationality, of the oppressed. Another thing that's interesting to think of is what Marxists have historically said about the Black population in the United States. In Lenin's tract that we just read from, The Right of Nations to Self-Determination, he doesn't anywhere specifically mention the Black population in the United States. And similarly, Marx never explicitly talks about the formation of uh, national consciousness within the United States Black population. But it is important, I think, to look at what they do say. So, and I'm not actually going to read any quotes about this, but I just want to bring it up to as an exercise to think about is what sort of particular conditions the Black population in the United States has historically faced, and what historical conditions were present that might lead a group like the SWP to have a formulation on Black nationalism. So Karl Marx actually did write quite a lot on the Civil War and slavery. And, historically, the conditions which Black nationalists have pointed to in justifying their ideas of Black people constituting a nation has come out of the experience of slavery and the very extreme oppression, they would call it national oppression, of the slave system. And after emancipation, basically the Jim Crow racist laws and both de facto and de jure system that maintained Black people as second-class citizens or non-citizens in the United States. So yeah, the Robert Blackburn book is interesting to look at in the context of the Civil War. Lenin himself did talk about the oppression of Black people in the United States. So in this piece, kind of an obscure article, but he actually explicitly talks about the US Black population and the legacy of slavery. And compares it to serfdom in an interesting way. But I'm bringing this up mostly to jog the participants, the viewers, thinking about the particular conditions that the Black population has had to face and why that might be related to the idea that Black people actually constitute a nation in themselves. Okay. Now, the SWP grew out of the experience of other socialist parties in the United States of America, and the leader of the SWP was very active in many of these parties. He was active in the Socialist Party, he was active in the Communist Party, the CPUSA, and in his book, First 10 Years of American Communism, he has two really good quotes that I think isolate the history of socialist parties' orientation and relationship with the Black population. And in the process of reading this, we're also looking at one of the SWP's own founders thinking himself. Okay, so the early I'm reading the quote, the earlier socialist movement, out of which the Communist Party was formed, never recognized any need for a special program on the Negro question. It was considered purely and simply as an economic problem, part of the struggle between the workers and the capitalists. Nothing could be done about the special problems of discrimination and inequality this side of socialism. Next quote, the difference, and it was a profound difference between the Communist Party of the 20s and its socialist and radical ancestors, was signified by its break with this tradition. American communists in the early days, under the influence and the pressure of the Russians in the Comintern, were slowly and painfully learning to change their attitude, to assimilate the new theory of the Negro question as a special question of the doubly exploited second-class citizens, requiring a program of special demands as part of the overall program, and to start doing something about it. Okay, so again, what are the key points that we get from these two quotes? One is that the early socialist movement didn't really have a particular program on the Black population. We're not even talking about Black nationalism, just the Black population, period. That they subsumed the particular struggles of Black people in the United States to the more general struggle for socialism, the more general struggle, more general struggle for socialism. And he's saying that this changed basically with the Russian Revolution. With the Russian Revolution and the experience of the Bolshevik Party and its concerns with the oppressed nationalities of Russia, this various Western Asian groups, of the various, of Jews, of Tatars, etc., that the Communist International that grew out of the Russian Revolution forced the American socialist movement, particularly the communists, to come up with a particular policy and particular formulations on the Black population in the United States. So in this chapter of his book, First 10 Years of James Buchanan's book, First 10 Years of American Communism, he goes on to praise the early CPSA, even though previously it had no special program. He goes on to praise it for being the first socialist party in the United States to have a particular program on the Black population, and it having doing particular work on the right of nations to self-determination. As we saw in the timeline, right here, one of the things that it eventually developed by the late 20s, though by this time the Trotskyists had been expelled from that party, was the idea of a black belt, what's called the Black Belt thesis, which was developed by a leader named Harry Haywood in conjunction with the Communist International, which basically said that the Black population in the United States wishes or will wish to seek out to carve out its own state, its own sort of Black Soviet republic within the territory of the United States. The idea that there will be a new nation formed in the so-called Black Belt by Black people, for Black people, as its own nation. And as we'll see when we look more into the SWP, while people like James Buchanan praise and support the Communist Party for developing a program on Black nationalism, they have a couple key criticisms of the Black Belt thesis. And we'll see this surface time and time again in the rest of the history and through the rest of this presentation. So again, just to quickly reiterate, I'm just going to go through this really quickly. The core activists that formed the SWP came out of, previously they came out of left wing, the Socialist Party, but in the IWW, but the core group formed out of the expulsion from the Communist Party, CPUSA, in 1928. So although the party wasn't technically formed until 1938, the core group emerged out of an expulsion in 1928. Actually, hold on, let me get a drink of water. Okay.
Yo, that was the best part so far.
You said what?
Oh wait, I forgot you're recording this. My bad.
Yeah. Okay. All right, so in the early years of what James Buchanan refers to as American Trotskyism, basically that I'll have to redo that, but basically the period between the 1928 expulsion of the Trotskyists from the Communist Party to 1938, when the SWP was eventually formed, James Buchanan refers to that as the early years of American Trotskyism. So this is before the SWP actually formed as a concrete party, but the core activists were together and were working in different groups. And they actually published their own newspaper called The Militant. In these so-called early years of American Trotskyism, although I can't find in my research any particular solid program on Black nationalism, they did in their newspapers have attention towards the Black struggle, which kind of set them apart from a lot of other socialist parties at this time. But it wasn't a strong formulation on Black nationalism. I'm going to fill this in more later, but that's basically the major point. And I'm basically at this point, I'm working on figuring out exactly what newspapers, what issues I want to highlight, what excerpts I want to take from which issues of The Militant. But also in this period was an interview, which would later become important for the SWP and its formulations of its own policies. And this interview was between Leon Trotsky, after he was exiled from Russia, with A. Swabek, on Swabek, who was one of the core groups amongst James Buchanan, who eventually helped form the Socialist Workers' Party in 1938. Okay, so we're going to read this quote. The Negroes are not yet awakened, and they are not yet united with the white workers. 99.9% of the American workers are chauvinists in relation to the Negroes. They are hangmen, and they are also towards the Chinese. It is necessary to teach the American beasts. It is necessary to make them understand that the American state is not their state, and that they do not have to be the guardians of the state. Those American workers who say the Negroes should separate when they so desire, and we will defend them against our American police, those are revolutionists. I have confidence in them. Okay, so once again, a couple of things that Trotsky is saying to this American Trotskyist activist, A. Swabek, who eventually helped form the SWP. One thing is he's saying that American workers, the American white working class, is in an oppressive relationship with the Black population. He's saying that it's actually white workers who are, as he puts it, beasts to the Black population. And he's also saying that if Black people desire to separate, and then it's to be, Trotsky says that the real revolutionists would be the ones the real revolutionists would be the white workers who support Black people in that decision towards independence. So in other words, Trotsky is saying that Black people face a type of oppression, and if they, from white people, including white workers, and if they wish to separate in whatever form that takes, then real revolutionary white workers should support that. Really interesting stuff that Trotsky is saying, and this will become important. This idea these ideas will become important to the SWP's own formulations. Okay, so again, the SWP forms in 1938, and in that same year, there were actually three other key interviews with Trotsky in Mexico City in 38 on Black nationalism. Those interviews were conducted by a very famous Black socialist, intellectual, activist, C.L.R. James, originally from Trinidad, but did a lot of work in the UK and in the US. And shortly after that, there was a convention, a founding national convention of the SWP. And two resolutions, which were written by C.L.R. James, were drafted for that convention and eventually adopted in 1939. And those were actually written by C.L.R. James himself. So in 38, in the 30s, the early years of the SWP, this was the period, this was actually the period in which the party's formulations, the formal formulations and resolutions on Black nationalism were probably most important. It was a formative time, and C.L.R. James was a pioneer in this work. So I want to read three different quotes, each from an interview, from the three interviews with Trotsky between C.L.R. James in Mexico City. Trotsky says, Comrade Johnson, oh, by the way, C.L.R. James was going by the pen name J.J. Johnson at the time. So so Johnson in this case means C.L.R. James. So Trotsky says, Comrade Johnson used three verbs: support, advocate, inject the idea of self-determination. I do not propose for the party to advocate. I do not propose to inject, but only to proclaim our obligation to support the struggle for self-determination if the Negroes themselves want it. It is not a question of our Negro comrades, it is a question of 13 or 14 million Negroes. And I'm just going to read all three in succession. So this is the next one. There's a certain analogy with the Negroes. They were enslaved by the whites. They were liberated by the whites, so-called liberation. They were led and misled by the whites. And they did not have their own political independence. They were in need of a pre-political activity as Negroes. Theoretically, it seems to me absolutely clear that a special organization should be created for a special situation. By the way, this sort of thinking in this quote will be influential to the SWP's formulation that they will support the creation of an independent Black political party in the United States. But I'll continue. We must say to the conscious elements of the Negroes that they are convoked by the historic development to become a vanguard of the working class. What serves as the brake on the higher strata? It is the privileges, the comforts, it is the privileges, the comforts that hinder them from becoming revolutionists. It does not exist for the Negroes. What can transform a certain stratum, make it more capable of courage and sacrifice? It is concentrated in the Negroes. If it happens that we in the SWP are not able to find the road to the stratum, then we are not worthy at all. The permanent revolution and all the rest would only be a lie. Okay, Now I want to go, now I want you to think, so those are three quotes from, from three different interviews with Trotsky between C.L.R. James and other members of the SWP in 1938, the same year of the founding of the SWP. Now we're going to look at the two resolutions drafted by J.J. Johnson or C.L.R. James in 1930. They were written in 1938, but adopted in 1939. And I want you to think about how these quotes might have influenced the wording and formulations in the two resolutions that were ultimately adopted by the early SWP. Okay. One, furthermore, the awakening political consciousness of the Negro not unnaturally takes the form of a desire for independent action uncontrolled by whites. The Negroes have long felt, and more than ever feel today, the urge to create their own organizations under their own leaders and thus assert, not only in theory, but in action, their claim to complete equality with other American citizens. Such a desire is legitimate and must be vigorously supported, even when it takes the form of a rather aggressive chauvinism. Okay, and I'm just going to continue on. This is the longest quote. Actually, we'll stop right here and just touch on a couple key points here. One is that just like one of the previous quotes we looked at with the interview with Trotsky, the SWP is saying that it will support independent action by Black people in the United States. And it's suggesting that it will support an independent political, a sort of independent political organization uncontrolled by whites, formed by Blacks for Black nationalist purposes, basically. Then we're gonna read this quote. Hold on, I'm actually gonna pause the recording real quick. You know, that's funny. I forgot to resume the thing. It's okay. I'm gonna continue. I forgot to resume the recording, but we're on to the 1960s. So there's a couple things that happened in the 1960s that led to a sort of important change in conditions and corresponding change in the SWP's policies towards Black nationalism. So one, of course, is the experience of anti-colonial rebellion. So in the late 50s and throughout the 60s, various African nations gained their independence, and the experience of Black people on the African continent struggling against European colonization and eventually gaining independence was a huge boon to the Black nationalist movement in the United States. And you see in the 60s the rise of, for the first time in a long time, very nationwide organizations, Black nationalist organizations that had with momentum. Another thing is that the SWP in the 60s, in 61, 1981, I believe, ran a black um, party member for president as part of its presidential run. That was Clifton DeBerry. And it was a very conscious decision that they made to run Clifton DeBerry as a Black candidate. At this time, but one thing that happened was that in the process of DeBerry's presidential run and his tour around the United States, the experience with that election actually, hold on, let me pause. Okay, so the campaign of Clifton DeBerry, in the process of DeBerry going on tour and visiting various cities and talking about the Black struggle in the United States, the SWP started to think deeper and deeper and deeper about its formulations on Black nationalism and what sort of party work it would do on Black organizing and Black in relation to its formulations on Black nationalism. Okay. So one of the what's the word? Landmark, yeah. One of the landmark pieces of writing, pieces of work within the SWP that changed some of the thinking in the orientation towards Black nationalism was actually a speech to the youth wing of the SWP, the YSA, the Young Socialist Alliance. And the speech was titled "How a Minority Can Change Society" and was eventually turned into an article of the same title. Oops. So I want to read an excerpt from this article, which was again initially part of a speech. And by the way, you could actually hear the original speech online. It was actually recorded. But anyways, although in 1939, we accepted the idea that the Negro minority can lead the working class revolution and readily adopted that as our official position of the SWP, the truth is that it was only a surface acceptance and adoption. We were not yet ready, despite what we put in our resolution, to fully understand what Trotsky was trying to get us to see. In 6 or 7 weeks after our 1939 convention adopted this resolution, J.R. Johnson, the chairman of our party's Committee on Negro Work at the time, that's C.L.R. James, who had been under Trotsky's influence, the chief author of this resolution, wrote on our paper an article referring to the resolution. Johnson said that while the idea in the resolution was correct, and while that the placement of the Negro is in the very front, nevertheless, the formulation in the resolution was an overstatement. Instead of saying that the Negroes are destined to be the very vanguard, he wrote, it would have been more correct to say that they are destined to be in the very vanguard. This was a real weakening of the idea Trotsky had tried to persuade us of. Although it left the SWP with the most advanced position on the Negro struggle, it was a definite step backward. But now, with Trotsky long dead, I think we are able to return to that original unweakened idea and see it in an entirely different light, not as an overstatement, but as a cold, hard, factually correct appraisal of a vital possibility that can crucially affect the future of all Americans. Because what Trotsky could not teach us completely we have now been able to learn from the actual development of the Negro struggle itself right before our very eyes these last 2 or 3 years. What we were not advanced enough in the 1930s to accept as theory, we are now able to apprehend as concrete current events, because the fact is that the Negroes are already a vanguard. Basically, Brightman is saying that in 39, in spite of the fact that it's the work that it did, the resolutions that it adopted, basically put the SWP on its own as being unique in the history of American socialism, as being basically one of the few parties, and for a while, perhaps even the only American communist party or socialist party to advocate for Black nationalism explicitly. In spite of that, there was a hesitation to be comfortable with, there was hesitation to some of the ramifications of the theory. So in one such hesitation was hesitation towards the idea that Black people might actually lead a revolution in the United States, that they might lead a revolution before white workers ever lead a revolution. So, and that was the core message of this piece entitled How a Minority Can Change Society. The idea that Black people are an oppressed nationality, and that for the entirety of the United States, for all of the United States, it's actually Black people as an oppressed nationality that will be a vanguard for the entirety of the United States. Another key resolution in the 60s that illustrates the change in its actual stance and actions on Black nationalism, and shows that it doubled down in its support for Black nationalism and doubled down in its actually active work in the Black nationalist movement, was a 63 resolution entitled Freedom Now. It reads, the 1948 convention resolution of the SWP noted the appearance and growth of an embryo Negro nation within the nation. It is still an embryo today, but bigger and more mature. Racial and national sentiments have been fed and stimulated by the mockery of tokenism at home and the success of colonial revolution abroad. The Negro is keenly aware that as a second-class citizen, he is both a citizen and not a citizen. He sees plausibility in the concept of internal or domestic colonialism, which correctly stresses the many similarities between capitalist treatment of the Negro people in this country and the imperialist treatment of colonial peoples. Revolutionary socialists welcome the growth of such Negro nationalism and give its participants wholehearted collaboration in the fight against our common enemies. For us, Negro nationalism and revolutionary socialism are not only compatible, but complementary forces that should be welded closer together in thought and action. The common sympathy and support for the colonial revolution and hostility to imperialist domination is an important bond between these two movements. Hold on, let me pause it real quick. Right, so this resolution in 1963 shows a couple things. One is that they're looking back to their own formulation, that you can see the process of a nation being formed within a nation. The idea that Black people in the United States constitute a nation, and that there's racial and national sentiments that might eventually lead to their own assertion of independence as a total people, as as a totality of the population. Another thing that this resolution is highlighting is the connection between Black nationalism and the struggle against colonialism. It's drawing a connection between Black nationalism uh, and the similarities between the national oppression faced by colonies in Africa, for instance, and in Asia, and the sort of domestic colonialism that Black people in the United States face. Lastly, another key point that this resolution is sharing is that, like with previous resolutions, it's actually doubling down like previous resolutions, but in a much stronger and in a much stronger way, and going further than the previous resolutions. It's saying that there's no contradiction between Black nationalism and revolutionary socialism, and on the to the contrary, they're actually complementary. That the struggle for international socialism is actually assisted by the assertion of Black people of their own independence from their own oppressors and their own, given their own particular the particular conditions that they face. And this idea that Black nationalists and revolutionary socialists are fighting against common enemies and are allies led to some work in the party, led to particular party work. One thing is that the SWP explicitly supported Malcolm X, even before he left the Nation of Islam. The SWP became close collaborators with Malcolm X. Malcolm X was an avid reader of the SWP's newspaper, The Militant, and even spoke at his, Malcolm X spoke at the not conventions, but the SWP used to have, what's the word? Yeah, we'll just say conventions. They used to have, talks and the events. Malcolm X used to speak at the SWP's events, and the SWP, the publisher, Pathfinder Press, the party press, would republish Malcolm X's work, his speeches, and to this day, Malcolm X's collected speeches, you can find it copyrighted actually by Pathfinder Press. And even at Malcolm X's assassination, Paul Boutel, who would eventually run on the SWP as a Black candidate for vice president on the SWP ticket, he was actually present at Malcolm X's assassination. He actually died recently in 2016, and I wrote an obituary for him. But there was a deep connection between the SWP and Malcolm X, especially after he left the NOI, but actually even before he left the Nation of Islam. But another key thing is that the SWP supported the creation of a Black political party. So in the 60s, one such part, there was actually the creation of one such party, an independent political party that was, explicitly an independent Black party, not tied to the Democrats or Republicans, but Black and independent. And by the way, it was supported by Malcolm X, but it had a very short life. But the SWP um, um, was a very vocal advocate for this party. And you can see in this election poster that in Clifton DeBerry's campaign, in one of his election rallies and many of his election rallies, they had such things as James Sabaj, who was a collaborator with Malcolm X and his organization, the Organization of African American Unity, as well as Milton Henry, who was a leader in the Freedom Now Party. So this is the type of collaboration and collaborative work that the SWP was doing at the time. And that is actually I'm trying to see if I'm missing anything. That is actually the core material from the 60s that I'm ending with. But I just want to mention that the work done after this explosion of interest and activity within the SWP and Black nationalism led to its work in the 70s, which is probably the period in which the SWP was most adamant in its support for Black nationalism. It just became a core part of their program. It just became a core part of what they did and how they presented themselves. They presented themselves as being staunch supporters of Black nationalist politics, as well as key allies amongst Black nationalist organizations in their press, in their party work, in their conventions, etc., etc. Okay, so that's basically what I was going to conclude, but I just, for my own sake, want to go back to where I stopped. So I think I paused right after the 39 resolution. So then after I came back and I forgot to unpause, we read the other 39 resolution, and we basically said that what it's saying is that the idea of Black nationalism being a progressive thing that socialists should support comes out of the Russian Revolution. It comes out of what it's calling Leninist doctrine, and the experience of the Bolshevik support for all of the oppressed nationalities within the Russian Empire. Another thing that is seen from this is the idea that the SWP is counterposing its own formulations on Black nationalism, or in the way in which it goes about Black nationalism with that of the CPUSA. So I went much more in depth on this, and I explained it much more clearly, but I just want to kind of sticky note what I said. So unlike the Communist Party, which the CPUSA, as a majority white party, it advocated itself for the creation of a Black state as a majority white party. It said that we actually advocate for the creation of a Black state. Counterposed to that was the SWP, which says we're not going to advocate for a Black state, but if Black people as a whole want to separate and create their own state, we will support that. But it's an incorrect formulation to actually, we as the SWP, say to Black people that we're advocating for the creation of a Black state. Okay, then I talked about how in between the 30s and the early years of SWP and the 60s, which is when, for the first time since the Garvey movement in the early 20th century, there was the reemergence of a strong Black nationalist movement, the SWP didn't actually do that much concrete work on its formulations on Black nationalism. Part of this is because there just wasn't a strong and large Black nationalist movement. At the time, the basically the Black radicalism and the Black struggle in the United States was struggling against the extreme, racist policies of segregation and Jim Crow, and but there wasn't any strong Black nationalist movement. However, we do see that in such things as a resolution in 1948, they reaffirmed their support for Black nationalism. They even talk about the social conditions leading to the creation of a quote unquote nation within a nation. They also talk about the relationship between yeah, I mean, that's basically it. Well, I was going to say that they're basically reaffirming their support for Black nationalism in 48. And then and this is basically why I started recording again. I was talking about the 60s, how things start to change with the 60s. There's the experience of anti-colonial rebellion, and I talked more in depth about that, and how influential that was to the Black struggle in the United States. I talked about the rise of new Black nationalist organizations like the Nation of Islam, as well as the presidential run of a SWP candidate for president, Clifton DeBerry, who was a Black man from Chicago, ran on the SWP, and the experience of him running and him being forced to talk about the Black struggle as a SWP candidate amongst Black people led to some very critical thinking within the SWP about their own formulations. And basically that's why I resumed the recording. So I'm going to pause it here and I'm going to actually end the recording.